Record.
Before I introduce our next guest, please, after this, I have raffle cards, and for people online, everybody's included. So we're going to raffle off 3 gift cards. And then Andrew is giving us a tour of the law library. And then at 5 o'clock, we'll hope you'll join us. I'm going to say it wrong because I got it wrong. Is it the Hub or the Hut? The Hut. It is the Hut. At the Hut at 5 o'clock, if you'll join us for happy hour. So for our next session, I'm really pleased to have Christopher Brooks here with us as a professor and department chair in the Department of Computer Science at USF. He joined USF in 2002 after completing a PhD in computer science at the University of Michigan. He also holds an MS in computer science from San Francisco State University and a BA and JBA in English and journalism, respectively, from the University of Wisconsin. From 2010 to 2019, Professor Brooks served as an Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at USF. Professor Brooks' research examines the ways in which human and computational agents learn in shared environments, particularly when learning is difficult or costly. He is also interested in questions at the nexus of AI technology and policy, as well as at the interface of social justice and technology, and develops new techniques for effective teaching of computer science and AI. Michele Neitz is a visiting professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law and the founding director of the Center for Law, Tech, and Social Good. She is a current member of the United Nations Development Program's discussion group on AI and development in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as New York State Department of Financial Services Virtual Currency Advisor Board. She publishes and lectures regularly on ethical, regulatory, and social impact issues in emerging technology. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having us. So I have to give a shout out to Shannon Burchard at USF, who is the law librarian who let us know about this conference. And I also should say I went to undergraduate study. I did my undergraduate studies at Santa Clara, and I spent my 21st birthday at the Hut. So I will not be joining you. That's a little too close to home. So we are here to talk about emerging trends in AI, and we're going to do this in 2 parts. The first part, we'll do sort of a traditional deep dive into some very trendy topic, which is open source versus closed source. And we'll talk about the DeepSeek phenomenon, which I know you heard a little bit about earlier today. And then for the second part, we'd like to do a group exercise on safety and guardrails, where we're going to ask folks to pair up into 2s or 3s or 4s, whatever you're comfortable with. And we have some prompts to ask you to consider about some of the challenges you're facing with AI. So with that, I will turn it over first to Professor Brooks.
All right, thank you. So yeah, as Michele said and Laura said, I'm a computer scientist. And so I'm happy to answer lots of technical questions if people want that. You know, if you want to know, like, why is it that LLMs hallucinate and things like that, I definitely can answer that question for you. Maybe I'll put that on the stack for a little bit, though, and if people want to come back to those things, we can. I want to also briefly say that since I'm an AI person, I have to, but you're all librarians, so you'll appreciate me being pedantic about terminology, I hope. When we go to my conferences, what you all call AI is a really small piece of what we call AI. So what you all are talking about, which is super important, is what we would usually call a large language model. And it's great, but I'm mostly saying this because there's other things out there that maybe should be on your radar too, even though they're not hitting you just quite yet, right? So self-driving cars are AI, face recognition is AI, surveillance is AI, landing spaceships on Mars is AI, all that stuff. And that what makes it hard to talk about is it's not one technology, it's a whole group of things that kind of loosely fit into the category of like, wow, that's really hard and we got a computer to do it. Cool. But today we're mostly talking about large language models. But again, grab me offline if you want to talk about face recognition or image generation or those kinds of things, because it's pretty cool. But I think for our exercise, for this first part, we wanted to talk about this phenomenon of open source versus closed source. And I'm sure this is something that librarians have thought about a little bit, because I know you all know about open educational resources and open access. And this is something that's been around in the software world for a long time too. The open source movement It's been around for at least 30 years, probably longer than that. And it's always been around access and around freedom. That's kind of where, but free is in beer, or free is in speech, not as in beer is our joke. But it's not either one. It's free as in money, really, actually, which is a third axis for it. So open source software typically meant I give you the source code, and then you can take it and you can do things with it. You can modify it, you can re-release it, and there's a whole set of different license structures around what you can and can't do with open source. But it really gets to the point that the previous speaker was talking about, that it's meant to be about access and about justice, and not locking up intellectual property amongst a few companies, right? So if you've ever used MySQL as a database, if you've ever used Firefox as a web browser, those are open source programs that the developers decided to release the code out into the wild so that they could benefit the world. Now, you can also make money off of open source, right? Red Hat, who's one of the largest Linux installers, releases Red Hat as open source and then charges lots of money to help you get it installed because it's not so easy. So there's plenty of viable business models that use open source. MySQL, which I mentioned before, they give away the personal license, but the professional license they charge money for, the enterprise license. So lots of ways you can do open source. So what's different about these large language models? So when the first ones were, ChatGPT was the first probably that most people have heard about. And that's a closed source model, right? So what's a little bit different is there's really three aspects that you have to think about when you're talking about these large machine learning models. If it's a database, it's really just the code. But with Llama, which was the first one that was released by Meta, what Meta gave out was the source code for Llama. So I could go and download Llama, and if I had a $5 million cluster and a month of computing power, I could go and I could run Llama and I could train it and I could get the same sort of results that I got out of, that Meta got out of training Llama on their cluster. Now, I don't have those resources, so that didn't really help me. But you can also train Llama on smaller problems, right? And some of those problems are feasible for people with my kind of resources. And that leads to the second thing that Meta released, which is the weights. Okay, so I'm going to get technical for about 2 seconds here. So the way a neural network, which is the architecture that underlies these things, the way it works is it's a complex set of nonlinear functions. And sorry, that's too mathy. Really what it's doing is just adding up a whole bunch of numbers, and there's all these parameters in there that the algorithm has to figure out that tell how different inputs are balanced. So when you hear about a model having 7 billion parameters, right, like the early version of Llama did, that's what they mean, is there's 7 billion of these little weights in there. And the puzzle that the machine learning algorithm is trying to solve is find the right value for every one of those weights so that I get the outputs I want. And so it's just huge search through this space of 7 billion parameters. Now, you can release those weights too. You can open source that. So after you solve the problem, after you train Llama correctly, you can put those weights out there. And then somebody else can just take those weights and then they can run Llama themselves. And there's lots of sites out there, Hugging Face and Weights and Biases, if you've heard of either one of those. Those are sites that allow people to distribute their models and the weights so that other people can make use of them. Because once you have the weights, inference, that is generating a new string, is relatively cheap. It's so environmentally terrifying, but better than training for sure. So that's the second thing you can open source is the weights. And Llama did not do that for the most powerful models, or Meta didn't do that. They did it for some of the smaller models. DeepSeek has open sourced the weights. That's really interesting. We'll come back to that in just a second. Then there's a third thing, and this is kind of really unique to machine learning, and it wouldn't make any sense in the database world, but that's the training set, right? So the way that these large-scale large language models work is they take a huge collection of documents. And by huge, so for example, one that is often used is called the pile, or the common crawl is another one you might have heard of. So the common crawl is basically the entire web, all the reachable web that's open anyway, and it gets collected periodically. The pile is that plus every book that's in the public domain and every piece of data that is publicly accessible. And then what you do is basically you just churn through all that for a month or so, and you find statistical correlations between words or between tokens in these documents. So if you want to know why it hallucinates, we can unpack that a little bit more, because it doesn't have a world model. It doesn't understand what these words mean. It's just learning, like, you know, when I see the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog is probably the next thing, right? Sleepy caterpillar is less likely. Okay. But you figure that out just by consuming tons and tons of documents. That's the secret sauce that OpenAI and companies like that and Anthropic have, is effective training and then carefully curated training sets. Because as we all know, the web is full of garbage, and there's a lot of stuff in there that you would want to throw away. There's duplicates, there's, you know, things that are not true, and so on. So curating a training set that's going to be really effective is the third piece. And again, open sourcing in there has been kind of a mixed bag, right? So the Pile and Common Crawl are open source, but ChatGPT or OpenAI have not open sourced their training set. I think because they don't want to get sued, probably, because they're going to find the New York Times in there.
Yeah.
So where do we land on all this? So what, right? So on one hand, again, DeepSeek came out just recently, and two big contributions. One was they open sourced both the code and the weights. So not only could I use their service, not only could I train my own version of DeepSeek, but I could take the whole weights and just run it. That's a big deal. And it allegedly trains for several orders of magnitude less than OpenAI, which is interesting. Now, the hard part is it's coming out of China, and there's not a lot of documentation either about how the training was done or what's in the weights. And this is the tricky part with neural networks, is you can't look inside them and say, oh, I see where that word cat is stored, right? It's all a bunch of numbers. And so we don't know what DeepSeek was trained on or what type of information it might generate apart from testing it out. So it's a little bit of a black box that way, which is nerve-wracking. But so it raises this question, and then maybe I'll hand it over to Michele here. On one hand, you know, openness is awesome, right? That is access, it's justice, just like you were talking about before. If I have the ability to download DeepSeek and run it on my own machine, great. I don't need to pay OpenAI anymore. I don't need to trust OpenAI's answers anymore. I don't need to worry about, you know, who they're beholden to. I can do it all myself. On the other hand, there's a real concern amongst some people that open sourcing these models is kind of putting them out into the wide world, and we can't necessarily guarantee how they're going to be used after they're open sourced, right? You know, who's to say that some bad actor couldn't download DeepSeek with the weights that have been provided and start using it to generate disinformation? They certainly could, right? And you can do that with Llama. That's been a big problem with it. This has been a tension throughout computer science. When I was driving down here, Michele, you maybe remember this because we're about the same age. Up until about the mid-90s, this was the story with encryption. So I used to even have a T-shirt that had the PGP code for public key encryption on it. It said, this T-shirt is a munition, because until 1996, you couldn't distribute encryption algorithms outside the US. They had to be weaker. And there was a lot of controversy about storing, the NSA wanting to store your keys and be able to read your data. And open source encryption was considered a problem for the same reason, that it could be used to harm people, and it could, you have secret communication that the NSA couldn't listen to. I don't know if I think that's a bad thing, but the NSA did. So that's the concern that they're having now with open source models versus closed source. Is on one hand, open source provides this access for everybody who might want it. On the other hand, what are the legal and liability implications if you open source your model and release out into the world and somebody misuses it? So maybe that's a great place to hand it off to you, Michele, and let you talk about that.
Sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the social impact that we're discussing here, but I also want to touch on legal issues since we're lawyers. So I think, or we work with many, many lawyers, right, and depending, or law students. And so I think that I'm going to pick up on what you were saying, and it does tie to what we just heard about social justice and access to justice. On the one hand, I'm going to make the case for open source like Llama and DeepSeek. I sit on a UN working group, and it's focused mostly on people who are trying to encourage AI development in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what I hear from them is we are going to get left behind. Right now, this power that's inherent in these AI machines is centralized in these large, 3 or 4 large tech companies in California. And folks who are in Argentina and Chile and other places who are nervous about getting left behind are wondering, how are we going to access that power? We can't access that computing power because we can't afford it. So the rise of an open source model like DeepSeek is actually seen around the world as a great equalizing force, right? That finally now, especially in regions that have traditionally been marginalized or left behind in tech advantages, now there's a way for them to play with all of us, right? It's going to level this playing field. I would also say the bonus of these sorts of open source models, I also teach business law, is taking it out of the hands of these large mega tech companies and putting it in the hands of smaller businesses and even smaller law firms or smaller libraries that can actually curate their own data sets if they so choose with these open source models. So in that sense, it really does, it's really the democratization of AI in a lot of ways that is really an exciting thing for people who are concerned about access to justice. And then there's a flip, right? So I was talking about this morning because I had an advisory board meeting for our center, and I have someone who's an AI lawyer for Microsoft on our board. And he said one of their concerns at Microsoft is that people who have licensing agreements with Microsoft for ChatGPT, or who have their ChatGPT licenses and they followed all the trainings and they're approved vendors, they're worried that folks in those organizations are going to jump onto DeepSeek for a minute, or they're going to jump onto the free version of ChatGPT for just a minute and not appreciate that there is no protection for their data in these non-licensed AI chatbots. And I said, I told him, I'm talking to librarians today, and I need to let them know that, like, especially for your lawyers or your students, like, you can't just jump from one to the other if your firm has a licensing agreement with Anthropic or with ChatGPT, for example. Why? Because they're closed source, right? So they're going to be in a position to offer these licenses that are very expensive, and so people are going to want to compare. I hear from students that are telling me, oh, it's fun to jump from one to one and kind of see the different results that you get, which is fine if you're doing things like, what's the best Italian restaurant? It's not fine if you're uploading confidential information, right? And so one of the big concerns with these open source models is confidential information. What's going to happen to this data? We don't know where the DeepSeek data goes. In that sense, they're not very open, I guess, right? We don't know what they're doing with that data. We know that corporations like Microsoft, like Anthropic, and these other large companies are at least saying that they're focused on social responsibility and responsible development of AI and are taking actions, and regulators are watching. But that's not true with some of these open source models, which leads us to the negative aspects, right, of democratization. So you mentioned bad actors. People are really getting nervous about bioweapons, right? You could use DeepSeek to create a bioweapon, potentially. You could use it for all kinds of national security problems, such as, let's just upload, I don't know, federal employee data into DeepSeek to see what happens, right? And we don't know where that's going. And so there are a lot of risks here. For your work, I think legally, the risks are really, I'm sure folks already know this, but data privacy is huge. Knowing who the actors are is huge. If you're at a firm that has, or a school that has a licensing agreement, making sure everybody in the office is aware of it and knows how to do it. And then the last thing I'll say, through the center, I train government officials on emerging technology and related legal issues, blockchain and AI and things like that. And one of the key things that people need to be aware of are the new laws in California around AI that folks need to know how those apply to our work. But I also will say, one of the things I've learned in training government officials, like I train people on Wednesday, is that they're not at this level yet. They don't have the resources to be able to be at this level yet, to be thinking about what all of you have thought about today, because it's just not there for them. And the resources are shrinking even more now. And so there's going to be a real push to educate government officials about some of these things. We don't want IRS junior, associates trying to see if DeepSeek will make it easier for them to do their jobs when uploading data. So I think spreading the word as much as we can about these differences is when we talked about what we think is a really hot emerging trend. This is one that we think is really important. Do you have anything else to add?
One little nuance in all this is, because I totally agree with what you said, data privacy is huge, right? And, I work at university, and so we need to know about FERPA. If you're in a hospital, you need to know HIPAA. And, so in addition to open source, closed source, there's, where your data is being held. Is it in the cloud or is it locally within your organization? And most of, all of the ones that we've listed up there, by default, DeepSeek is a cloud service that is going to hold your data someplace. We don't know where, right? As is ChatGPT and as is Anthropic. And so when you pay for that professional service, what you're paying for is their security experts to make sure that what they say is really true. And yeah, Joe Schmo from down the street who's installed their own version of DeepSeek on the computer in their basement may or may not be FERPA compliant. I'm trying not to pitch a research project, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Go for it.
Which is, would it not be cool for all, say, the Jesuit universities to have their in-house version of DeepSeek or Llama or whatever, where we could control the provenance and we would know what was in that. And then you can circumvent having to give all your money to OpenAI, but still have as much trust as you all have in your IT department here. And I know Santa Clara's top rate, Yosef, we're okay. But, we do all right. So anyway, that would be a way to look forward, is to create non-commercial large language models, special purpose for things like law, that are not controlled just by profit and by quarterly earnings, but by some other purpose.
Yeah, I like that research project.
Yeah,
we should do that. New project for the center. Any questions on this topic before we go on?
It was just a question online. What are AI hallucinations?
Oh,
Great
perfect.
question. Yeah, so I'm going to give you a technical answer and then a less technical answer. Okay, so and I don't even love the word hallucination, because hallucination implies that you have an internal mental state that is different than the external world, right? But large language models don't have an internal mental state. That's like the key. That's the crux of the biscuit. When you search on LexisNexis for a phrase, you put in, cat food. And what it does, and by the way, this was AI technology 35 years ago, so when I got started. What it does is it says, all right, well, I've indexed all these articles that you have, and let's find all the ones that contain the keyword cat food in it. And then I'm going to give you those articles back. And I'm going to try to sort them so that the stuff you like is at the top. But there's always a real article that I'm referring to. And what I'm telling you is as true as that article is, right? So we call that ground truth in the AI world, right? So if I can point off to a database, and I can say that fact is in that database, and I fetched it back for you, great, there you go. Large language models don't do that. They don't have a database under them. Well, asterisk, let me come back to that. The vanilla ones don't. Instead, they really just do a very fancy version of what your phone does when you're texting and you keep hitting the middle button over and over to autocomplete. All they're trying to do, because remember I said when you train them, they're just looking at these statistical correlations between words, right? Quick brown fox jumped over the blank. Then when you prompt it, it's doing the same thing. It's what the answer to the question, the capital of France is, and it says, what's the most likely word to finish that sentence? Based on my just stats, right? It doesn't know where Paris is, it doesn't know where France is. It just knows that string tends to come next, right? So the way I often think about this, I really wish they'd never put the question answering thing on ChatGPT. I feel like that messes it up a lot, or messes up our mental model of how it works, because we treat it as a human, right? We anthropomorphize it. If we had just said, summarize this document for me, which is what it was originally intended to do, that would be great. And then I would know, like, okay, check it, because this is just an auto-generated summary. But so to answer your question, how do hallucinations work? So again, it's just generating a sequence of tokens, right? Just a sequence of words, and it's gonna maybe be true, right? And maybe not be true. There's nothing where it checks and says, is this reality? And so this is, in terms of next trends, like what's coming, is like the Westlaw AI tool, the Lexis AI tool that you guys were talking about before. where after that sequence of tokens is generated, then it tries to go back and do a more traditional database search and say, can I find an article that verifies this? What's weird though is it's all post hoc, right? It's after the answer is generated that then they try to fill in, where did that source come from? What's the provenance of that information? I personally don't think we're ever going to get all the way there with that approach. I think you need to start with a database query and then augment it with the LLM, but we don't know how to do that yet. So the short answer is because there's no world model, there's no there. It's not really intelligent. It's just a stochastic parrot is the phrase that we sometimes use. Because of that, it's going to it's like your friend at the bar who's really smart, but sometimes makes stuff up. That's kind of how I explain it to my students. All right. It's right after. It's a really good bullshit machine. Sometimes that's great. When I'm playing D&D with my son, it is awesome. It plays a really good version of D&D. If I was writing a legal case, I would want to check my work afterwards.
Just a quick question that my non-technical background brain. So with DeepSeek, it seemed like there was discussions about the amount of compute that is needed for training a model and the amount of compute for inference, like what the large language model has to do to process your query, right? And then there was an interesting on a legal tech blog writing about how DeepSeek can be more secure because you can run it on a local, law firm. But I can't get my mind around, with the compute power needed for how maybe this is too technical, but I guess you can then just run a model that's so compressed that you can, it's hard for me to get my mind around that you can run a model locally.
Yeah. So that's the big push. So you're probably running one right now on your laptop, or Apple is probably running a bunch of stuff on your laptop where they've made a number of optimizations to make it small enough to run on your laptop or on your phone. That's the next thing everybody's trying to do. There's a trade-off between quality of results and size of the model. For simple stuff, what's the capital of France? Great. The small models do really well. For the really complex, solving hard math problems and stuff like that, they're not going to. But yeah, that was the big aha.
Right. Okay.
And one more last thing on that. People have been kind of expecting DeepSeek for a while in my field, because what always seems to happen is we come up with some big technical idea in the computer world, and then really quickly it gets cheaper, right? If you guys have heard of Moore's law, which is not a real law, it's just an observation. But basically says the price of doing something halves every 18 months. That's kind of an overstatement. But so people have been waiting for that with large language models, and they've just been getting more and more expensive. And everybody's like, when's this going to happen? Where all of a sudden the technical breakthrough happens, and DeepSeek might be that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we're going to ask you to talk and move on to our group exercise. We have lots of questions with not a lot of time to do them. So you can pick the questions that you like. I think we have about 20 minutes. So we wanted to know, it would be great to group up with people who work at a similar organization, but I know some of you, there are multiple people from different places, so you can choose to split up or you can choose to be together. You can just be with the person next to you. It doesn't really matter. It is Friday afternoon. So we wanted to ask what issues are coming up for your organization around AI safety and guardrails and the implications, because we thought it might be fun for you to talk to each other about what you're seeing and whether people are seeing similar things. Some of the things that came up, and we did this brainstorm with Shannon, so another shout out to Shannon, document summarization, client confidentiality issues, as we've discussed, scrubbing data is something Shannon talked about, and translating as well are things that she's seeing and that she knows are issues. And then if you have time, we also are curious to know, what are you most worried about in your work? It'll be interesting to see if that's the same thing across law firms and academia and government offices. And I don't think we're going to have time for our last one, which was, but you could think about how can you—
That's the one I like.
Maybe skip to the end then, you'll have, so that you can tell Chris. How can you learn or test new products without violating your organizational policies? And this goes back to the, can I jump over to DeepSeek for just a minute on my work computer to see what would happen? And does your organization have a good sandbox? Because maybe that's a route that you could offer or propose that they would have in order for you to be able to do that.
Or maybe that's another flavor of this research question is, what would you like for a sandbox? In my world, we often talk about benchmarking data and, here's 100 documents that I can run all these different things on and I can see how they do. what would that look like for you all? If there was like a place where you could just go and try things out and throw it away when you're done.
Okay, so 2s, 3s, 4s, it's up to you, whatever you like. And we'll do about maybe 15 minutes.
Yeah, and we'll just ask you to report back out. And
And Zoomers, because there was a pandemic and I know how to do this to teach on Zoom, we're going to put the Zoomers into breakout sessions so that you're able to talk to each other. So let me do that now. I'm just going to do them randomly and we'll have about 3 or 4 participants in each room. Okay.
Sure.
I'm not on like I use that.